Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. This section will be about Zakah. Now, Zakah is a pillar of Islam, as important as Tawheed itself, as knowing the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as knowing how to pray properly, knowing how to fast in Ramadan, and knowing how to do Hajj properly. Zakah is a pillar just like all those pillars. And we'll be drawing from the book called The Accessible Conspectus by Sheikh Abu Shuja' al-Asfahani, Matan al-Ghayat wa Taqrib, and the translation is by Sheikh Musa Ferber. And this is Shafi'i fiqh. So this is the Shafi'i perspective on Zakah. What's the definition of the word Zakah itself literally? It literally means growth and purification. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's an obligation just like the 5 daily prayers and fasting in Ramadan. Rejecting Zakah as an obligation is a form of disbelief. It's like rejecting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. It can be translated as a mandatory alms on disposable savings reserved for 8 categories of people. Zakah is a transfer of ownership. It is not a donation. It's a transfer of ownership from the donor to the recipient. It is a right of the recipient, not a favor done to them. Therefore, depriving them of zakah is a form of theft. So as soon as zakah is due, the recipient is already the owner of that zakah. The person giving the zakah is merely protecting that property of the recipient. So that property is in your, when zakah is due on you, that property is not yours anymore. It belongs to someone else and it's in your protection until it reaches them. The niyyah, or the intention, is required prior to giving it. So when we give zakah, we have to be giving it with the intention of zakah. We can't apply zakah or the intention of zakah to past donations. Let's say somebody gave the day before the zakah was due, they gave an amount equal or more than that in donation, in sadaqah. We can't retroactively apply our intention to that. The zakah has to be given with the intention of zakah. Zakah cannot be given to a fictitious entity. You can't say, I'm giving my zakah to this masjid or to this school or even a hospital or institutes. The zakah has to reach one of the 8 categories of people directly. Now, there are organizations that specialize in that. So if there's an organization that you trust, that you know without a doubt that money will reach one of the 8 categories of people, then it's okay to give to that organization. But we can't give it just to a general fund or a general institute without it specifically being given to one of the 8 recipients. Debt does not lift the obligation of zakah. So if someone has a student loan, mortgage, credit card debt, that does not immediately disqualify them from giving zakah. Because if that were the case, then very, very few people would give zakah given the times that we live in. So we'll go into the goals of zakah. The goal of zakah, number 1, it's to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a major act of worship. Allah mandated this and we obey. That's first and foremost. Some other benefits: it circulates wealth to maximize the self-sufficiency of vulnerable zakah recipients. So the goal of zakah in terms of the recipient, the one receiving zakah, is to make them self-sufficient. It's not to dangle a check in front of them once a month where they barely survive and barely meet their basic needs. It's to eventually make them self-sufficient so that in the future they themselves become zakah donors. As we said, one of the definitions of zakah is growth and purification. So we want the person to grow in their wealth. We want the recipient to grow in their wealth, not just to barely scrape by and survive month to month. And number 2 is to bless the wealth of the zakat donors. So what this does is it unifies the hearts of people across the economic spectrum, and this achieves and maintains societal happiness and stability at all levels. It removes envy, arrogance, and resentment from the hearts of people. The wealth of zakat donors actually increases through blessings. So even if someone wants to give zakat just for their own self-interest, their own wealth will increase by giving zakat. Because number one, they fulfill an act of worship and Allah blesses their wealth. And number two, the zakat recipients, they'll make dua for the zakat donor. Because if the zakat donor makes more money, then they get more money. So the zakat recipients will make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase the wealth of the zakat donors. So it's a win-win all around for society. This is a slide taken from a talk by Sheikh Talal Ahdab on Shafi'i fiqh of zakat. Just some more of the wisdom and benefits in a nice graphic. So there are educational benefits, societal benefits, devotional benefits, and economical benefits. So what's the criteria for becoming a zakat donor versus becoming a zakat recipient? To be a zakat donor, one has to meet the following 5 criteria. Number 1, to be Muslim, al-Islam. Number 2, freedom, or al-Hurriya. Number 3, to have complete ownership over the property that's subject to zakat, al-Milku Tam. So far, it's to be a free Muslim that has complete ownership over the property that is zakatable. And number 4, the threshold, and nisab. And nisab is a very common term that's always going to be mentioned on the topic of zakah, so it's important to know. And nisab is basically the cutoff value of the property. When the property reaches that cutoff value or surpasses it, then the property becomes subject to zakah. And number 5, the passage of 1 lunar year where that property is in your possession. And that's called al-hawl. Al-hawl is also an important term to know on the subject of zakah. So to summarize it, to be a zakah donor, one has to be Muslim, free, in complete ownership of the property that is zakatable. The value of that property has to meet the threshold, and the passage of 1 lunar year has to occur with that property in your possession. And the lunar year that follows the moon is around 355 days long, while the solar year that follows the sun is 365 days. So the lunar year is about 10 days shorter than the solar. The exception for being a zakat donor here is zakatul fitr. Now zakatul fitr is different than zakatul mal. Most of this topic is around zakatul mal. But zakatul fitr is an obligation on every Muslim man, woman, and child. It's to be paid in Ramadan, and the deadline to pay it is by Salatul Eid, on the day of Eid. But every man, woman, and child is obligated to pay, and obviously the caretaker of the home is the one responsible for paying it on everyone's behalf. Now, if the caretaker has non-Muslim family members, then they're not obligated to pay zakat al-fitr on their behalf. But every Muslim man, woman, and child in the household, you are obligated to pay zakat al-fitr for them. But we'll talk about that more later. What about the zakah recipient? There are 8 categories of zakah recipients, and they're outlined in the Quran in the 9th chapter, verse number 60. The first category is al-fuqara, or the poor. The second category is al-masakin, the needy. And it's understandable to ask, what's the difference between the poor and needy, the faqir and the miskin? Technically, the faqir is the one who only has enough wealth to meet less than 50% of their basic needs, while the miskin can have wealth and a job, but they're able to meet less than 100% of their needs. So they could meet a little bit over 50%, between 50%, but less than 100% of their basic needs. And basic needs, the definition of basic needs varies from time and place. Right? Every society has their own definition of basic needs, and in our society, it means not just food, drink, and shelter, but somebody has to have a sustainable job. They have to have a health insurance and car insurance. It's basically, and a vehicle, and it's basically whatever is needed to make them self-sufficient in the society that they're in. That's what a basic need is. So that's a difference between al-fuqara wal-masakin. Just to demonstrate that the zakah recipient isn't the homeless person that's destitute on the street. That's a false idea of who should get our zakah. Number 3, al-amilina alayha, the ones who work to administer zakah and distribute it. Number 4, al-mu'allafati qulubuhum, the one whose hearts need softening and winning over. And this usually refers to recent converts to Islam who are in a fragile, vulnerable state, and their families and societies might be boycotting them and giving them a hard time. So it's to help them. Number 5, fir riqab, to free the captive. Number 6, al-gharimin, those are who are in debt. Number 7, fi sabilillah, for the cause of Allah, and the scholars say that this mainly refers to people who voluntarily go out and engage in jihad with the proper authority. So it's the voluntary soldiers of jihad. And number 8, ibn as-sabil, the traveler. Now, between all of these 8 categories, they have to be Muslim. So zakah recipients have to be Muslim. Non-Muslims can receive sadaqah, right? They can receive general donations, but they can never receive zakah. The zakah is special for the Muslim that fits one of these 8 categories. So let's talk a little bit more about the zakat donor. So which properties are zakatable? Which properties are subject to zakah? Number 1 is livestock, and that refers to camels, cows, sheep, and goats that graze in a natural pasture. If somebody has to pay money in order to feed their livestock, then those livestock are not zakatable. Number 2, money, which is usually in Islamic jurisprudence refers to gold and silver, but can refer to our currency as well. Number 3 is agriculture, crops cultivated by humans, not crops that grow naturally on their own without any human intervention. And number 4, fruit, mainly referring to grapes and dates. And number 5, trade goods, which is any merchandise in any business. And some scholars also refer to fiat currency, which is government issued currency not backed by gold and silver, which is like the US dollar today, as trade goods. But we'll get into exactly how those values are determined. Now notice that these are disposable savings in the form of currency or property. Therefore, items of necessity, like your car that you use, your house that you live in, the land that you use, your clothes, your refrigerator, food and drink for yourself and your family, these are not included in zakah. So just to emphasize, zakah is only for disposable savings in the form of currency or property as above. What's the criteria for being a zakat donor? Just to summarize, to be a free Muslim who possesses any of the above properties in the amount that reaches the nisab or the threshold, and in some cases that property remains in his or her possession for 1 lunar year, or hawl. And the hawl mainly applies to money, livestock, and trade goods. It doesn't apply to fruit and agriculture. So what is the nisab? What's the threshold? For livestock, it gets very complicated. So that requires a scholar to really probe into. For money, the most common concept we'll hear of is the nisab of gold and silver. The nisab of gold is 85 grams of gold. The nisab of silver is 595 grams of silver. So if someone possesses 85 grams or more of gold or 595 grams of silver for more than for 1 lunar year, then they automatically owe 2.5% of this in zakah. Now we translate the gold and silver into currency. For the US dollar, the price of gold and silver fluctuates constantly. So you check what's the current value of gold in US dollars. And if you have that amount Usually for gold, 85 grams translates to between $3,000 and $4,000. So if you have that amount in savings for 1 lunar year, then you owe 2.5% of that in zakah. 595 grams of silver is about $300 to $400, so way less than gold. So some scholars say we should all use the silver standard so that more people pay zakah. If we use the silver standard, that means if you have whatever the price 595 grams of silver is, if you have, let's say it's $350, if you have $350 or more of disposable savings for 1 lunar year, then you owe 2.5% of that in zakah. So which one do we use, gold and silver? Scholars will differ on this, but if a currency is backed by one or the other, then you have to follow that standard. So if theoretically the US dollar was backed by gold, then we use the gold standard. If the US dollar was backed by silver, then we use the silver standard. But since it's backed by neither, then there'll be a difference of opinion on what's gold and on which standard to use. And so when does the clock start on the lunar year? When do we start counting for when the lunar year starts? As soon as the nisab is met. So as soon as the nisab is met, the clock starts 1 lunar year. Now, if the property falls below the nisab during that year, then the clock resets until the nisab is met. Then that year is interrupted and the clock resets until that nisab is met again. Zakah is not obligatory on lawful jewelry. So lawful jewelry means gold and silver for women, and mainly silver rings for men, because men, it's prohibited for them to wear gold. As long as the amount of jewelry is not considered excessive or obscene according to the owner's status and culture. So if the majority of people would logically consider the amount of jewelry that someone has to be excessive or obscene, then it's zakatable, and it depends on the status of the person and culture. So if it is considered excessive, then zakah is owed on all of the jewelry, not just the excess. Oh, this slide was a little bit out of place, but this basically shows how comprehensive of a system that zakah would be. And this is from Sheikh Talal's Shafi'i fiqh of zakah. He basically shows how different departments would stem from the department of zakah, basically showing how zakah is a comprehensive system that affects all levels of society. But this slide is out of place. So we'll continue with the nisab. Nisab on agriculture and fruit also gets a little complicated, but basically depends on what the fruit is, what the agriculture is, and if you're required to artificially irrigate and spend money to irrigate those crops, or if those crops were irrigated naturally without human intervention. But it's one of the categories that do not require a hawl, or 1 lunar year, to pass. As soon as the fruit's ripe, and if they meet the nisab, in this case of almost 610 kilograms, then the zakah is due on it. And how much zakah, 10%, 5%, 7.5, is based on whether it required natural or artificial irrigation. Now, trade goods, if somebody has a business with merchandise or investments, so those are based on the value of the merchandise or investments that are appraised at the end of 1 lunar year. So when does the year start? The year starts as soon as the business starts. And 1 lunar year comes to an end, 355 days come to an end. It's at that time that you appraise your goods and your investments and see if they reach the level of nisab. And if the goods were purchased with gold or silver, then either of those standards are used, however we purchase them. If not, like with fiat money, like we have now, then we use the gold standard. Then we use either the gold standard of 85 grams of gold, or 595 grams of silver to encourage more zakah. And these items must have been bought with the intention of continuing to trade, right? Not for personal use that you need. And the zakah is 2.5% of the value appraised at the end of 1 lunar year. So let's say somebody has a business trading in refrigerators, right? They have a refrigerator business. And they bought refrigerators that at the beginning of the year did not meet the nisab. So they start their business, they buy some refrigerators. It did not meet the nisab when they first bought it. But the clock is already ticking from when you started trading and selling the refrigerators, when the business started. At the end of one lunar year, if those refrigerators in your possession, if they meet the nisab, the appraisal value went up after a year, then zakah is owed. So the clock starts ticking for trade goods, not when you meet the nisab, when you start your business. And then at the end of 1 year, there's an appraisal, and then you determine based on the appraisal, the value of the property in my possession for the last lunar year, do they meet the nisab or not? Again, on zakat al-fitr, it's the only form of zakah that's obligatory upon every man, woman, and child in Ramadan without ownership, nisab, or hawl. None of that applies to zakat al-fitr. One scholar compared it to like doing sujood al-sahu, like if you make a mistake in prayer and you do an extra sujood at the end of prayer. This is similar to Ramadan. So our fasting will always have some mistakes and shortcomings. So zakat al-fitr is a way to purify those mistakes. It becomes an obligation after sunset, the day before Eid. So the day before Eid al-Fitr, the last day of Ramadan, after sunset on the last day of Ramadan is when it becomes an obligation, and the deadline to pay it is until Salatul Eid begins, the Salah itself, until the prayer of Eid itself begins. That's the deadline to pay it. And if you don't, you are sinful. And it's based on the volume of food, or a sa', which is about 2 liters of food. So it's based on volume of food, not value of anything. It's not based upon the value of any owned property. The only condition is to be a Muslim and to have enough provision for the day of Eid al-Fitr to feed yourself and your family. If you have enough on Eid al-Fitr to feed yourself and your family, you have to give zakat al-Fitr. And it's to be paid for yourself and each dependent who relies on your support. So your spouse, your children, your parents, your siblings, if they depend on your support and they're considered a dependent, then you have to pay for them. And 2 liters of food comes out nowadays to about around 10. Like this year in 2020 or 2021, it's going to be around $10 per head, $10 per person. And before it was given in food, but modern scholars have converted zakat al-fitr to cash equivalents. So the 2 liters is around $10 per person. There are some case studies, but for the sake of time, we won't read them explicitly. Well, basically, how do you determine if someone is zakat eligible? Like in this case, where somebody has $10,000 in savings, but this woman is still zakat eligible, because if she has no income but $10,000 in savings, then you take into account what's her life expectancy based on her society, her place and time. What's the average life expectancy, and we divide her savings over her life expectancy, and she could still we use it against the standard of poverty. So what's your average life expectancy in your time and place? What's the threshold for poverty in your time and place? And we take both of those things into account to determine if somebody is zakat eligible or not. And obviously circumstances can always change. Even if somebody has a job, let's say they have a yearly income and they have some savings, but because of state taxes, standard of living, like in a rural area versus the city, which is much more expensive, medical needs of themselves or their families, and taking care of dependents, all those things have to be taken into account to determine if somebody's zakat eligible or not. Now, who is it impermissible to give zakat to? There are 5 categories of people whom it is haram, it is prohibited to give zakat to them. Number 1 is the one who's already self-sufficient. And this seems obvious, but nowadays this term zakat eligible is being used by organizations that are already self-sufficient, but they're stretching one of the categories, fi sabilillah, which means for the sake of Allah, which again was categorized for voluntary soldiers, unpaid soldiers who are going and doing jihad. They're taking this and they're stretching it as far as they can, so that they're included in zakat eligibility, when in reality they are not zakat eligible, and that wealth ends up circulating amongst people who are already self-sufficient, instead of for whom it's truly destined for. And this is a tragedy of our modern time. Number 2, Ahlul Bayt, the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ and his family. The descendants of the Prophet ﷺ are not to receive zakah. They can receive gifts and sadaqah, but not zakah. Number 3, non-Muslims. Non-Muslims do not receive zakah, but again, they can receive sadaqah. Number 4, the dependents of the zakah donor. Now, if you're obligated to give zakah, you cannot give your zakah to people who you're already obligated to support, like your parents, your spouse, and your children. There's no giving zakat to them. And some people try to get away with keeping the wealth in their family by giving zakat to their own family members. This is haram. This is impermissible. And number 5 doesn't apply in our society, but it did apply to slave societies of the past, where Islam came to structure and control the institution of slavery and eventually did away with it. When before there was extreme rampant abuse, Islam came to set limits on it and eventually do away with it. But even all over the world nowadays, there's human trafficking, and slavery has by no means disappeared from the earth. So the 5th category is basically slaves who do not have a valid contract to buy their own freedoms. They cannot receive zakah, versus a slave who does have a valid contract where they can eventually buy their own freedom. They can receive zakah, so that it goes to purchasing their freedom. But again, that requires more. If someone wants details about that requires more input from a scholar. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.